Thank you very much. Thank you, INCORE, for inviting me and give me the possibility, besides giving this seminar, also to meet a lot of organizations and projects here, which is, of course, extremely interesting also for our work. As Brendan has said, I'm a lawyer, I'm not an archivist, but we are running this project, Archives and Dealing with the Past, together with the Swiss Federal Archives and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we also bring in the archival expertise through the Federal Archives, the Swiss Federal Archives, and we are working very closely with experts from all over the world, archival experts and dealing with the past experts. This gives me a bit the possibility to, and that's what I want to do today, a bit an overview what roles that archives in general, not necessarily oral archives, can play in dealing with the past processes and mechanisms. So I will be quite general and then try to get more specific when I answer your questions. We at swisspeace and also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we work with, oops, that's not what I wanted, so I can go back. With this circle. This is a framework we are using in our what is happening here? Sorry about this. With this circle, which is based on a report. On a report by the special rapporteur of the UN, Louis Joannet, who has published the so-called Principles Against Impunity, what they're called today, for the UN human rights bodies. And already in the 90s, he said you have to focus on different aspects if you want to deal with a violent past. A past where there was armed conflict or a repressive system. And he says you have to focus not only on justice, for example, or on the right to truth, but you have to look at different aspects. And he starts with the right to know, and he goes on to the right to justice, the right to reparation, and the guarantee of non-recurrence. And in all these different fields of how a society can deal with its past, its violent past, archives obviously play a very important role. I will start with the right to know. There are different mechanisms Louis Joannet mentions in his report, and which have obviously developed a lot since he has written this report in the 1990s. There are a lot of truth commissions, there are a lot of experiences now with different truth commissions, which are official, sometimes international, sometimes domestic truth-finding mechanisms, which use different means to somehow establish what one calls maybe an objective or a more objective truth. This is all often very contested, but it is a way to somehow get a narrative which is more acceptable for a majority of the people, and which can also be the basis then for further dealing with the past steps. There's also missing person commissions, mostly in conflicts where you have great numbers of missing persons. In the Balkans, missing person commissions were very important, also in contexts in South America. Investigation commissions are more and more relevant international investigation commissions, which are sent by the UN to find out or to establish facts, sometimes even during ongoing conflicts, as we have it now in Syria. We had it in the Gaza conflict, in Sri Lanka, in Libya. International commissions going to places and investigate the facts. These commissions, truth commissions, investigation commissions, use archives, existing archives if possible. This can be completely different archives, security forces archives, it's also municipal archives, hospital archives, land registries, and they themselves produce archives which are an important source for further dealing with the past, mechanisms such as tribunals, memorial or memorialization projects, and so on. And they form an important legacy for the societies concerned. Even in contexts where no formal dealing with the past mechanisms had taken place, archives are still used. I have an example here from Spain, where in a very late stage, historians started to try to find out what had happened during the Civil War and the Franco regime. You have still families of victims who've disappeared, who don't really know what happened to their family members, although this happened in the 30s or 40s. And it's very difficult, of course, now to establish. And there are impressive examples how district archives, state archives are used. For example, sometimes it's a bill of a funeral service which is used to find out where mass graves are placed or where bodies have been brought. And still today there are exhumations taking place in Spain, and family are finding out today what happened to family members in the 30s or 40s. So unexpectedly, archives can play a very, very crucial role in truth finding, even if there's no official truth commission or investigation commission. Very important is, of course, official archives such as police archives. I have here the example of the Stasi archive in Germany, which today is very important what's going on here, in finding out what happened during the Stasi, during the Democratic Republic of Germany, and how this state, this police state worked. And these archives are partly open to the public, but mainly to people who were concerned. So the access to security service archives, to police archives, military archives is an important issue. And in many, many contexts, there's very limited access to these archives, although they hold, of course, important information on human rights violations. The issue of what happens to archives of truth commissions is important as well. We have here a picture of the parts of the archives of the Truth Commission of Sierra Leone, which is still in boxes, although there is a plan to have a peace museum which would hold the archives of the Truth Commission and the international tribunal that had prosecuted the war crimes committed during the Civil War in Sierra Leone. And both archives obviously hold important information which is important and should be accessible to the people of Sierra Leone. The problem is there is lack of resources, lack of expertise, and this material is now just stored in the former buildings of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and not really accessible to the people of Sierra Leone, although there are interesting projects to open these archives. You have similar problems even in model countries like South Africa, where the access to the archives of the Truth Commissions are quite limited, although they are in the national archives. So if families, victims want to access files of the Truth Commissions, it's often not that easy, and this shouldn't be the case. They should be more accessible, better accessible than they are in reality. There are also examples of Truth Commissions in Guatemala. Guatemala had an international Truth Commission, which was initiated by the UN, and the archives of the Guatemalan Truth Commission are in the UN archives in New York, not accessible to people in Guatemala. There's also no copy in Guatemala which is accessible, and this, of course, should not be the case. The right to justice, it's more the punitive, retributive aspect of dealing with the past. It's more perpetrator-oriented than truth-finding. It adheres to fair trial principles, a very important aspect that is often forgotten in transitional processes, in process of transition, as you can see in Northern Africa. The issue of amnesties and how you handle amnesties, how you integrate amnesty issues in peace agreements is an important aspect of the right to justice. And then, of course, the mechanisms used are national, hybrid, international courts. And again, archives play a very important role. They are used by tribunals. Tribunals, especially international tribunals, have a much better access to archives than, for example, truth-finding mechanisms, truth commissions, because they can subpoena, they might have Security Council decisions behind them, as, for example, the ad hoc tribunals for former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. They had powers to access archives and state archives in Croatia and Serbia, and so they had access to real important information, which is usually not accessible because states try to tend to protect information which they think is relevant for state security. And this information often is obviously important for dealing with the past. So there's this problem of getting access to relevant information in state archives. Courts have a better access, also national courts. There's, for example, at the moment, a lot of trials going on in Argentina on what happened during the military regime in the 70s and 80s. And the courts, for example, they have a much better access to police and military archives than the Truth Commission had in the 1980s. Courts often have the advantage also that they can rely on previous work of truth commissions, investigation commissions, on their archives, because it's often the step that comes after truth seeking. I've mentioned the trials that go on in Argentina. Argentina had a truth commission right after the military regime, mainly to find out what happened to missing persons. It was also called Missing Person Commission, to find out the fate of missing persons. And then there, right after their report was released, there were some trials that started against military personnel involved in human rights violations, and this was stopped shortly after they have started with an amnesty law. So there was a strict amnesty law which prevented any further prosecutions, and it was removed only recently, some years ago, by a decision of the Supreme Court, which said that this amnesty law is unconstitutional. And only now, 3-4 years ago, prosecutors were able to start prosecutions, and obviously there's a problem that witnesses are not living anymore, or they have forgotten the details of the facts. A lot of material has disappeared. Documents in archives have disappeared, were destroyed, or are not found anymore. And nevertheless, the trials that go on, which actually allowed the prosecution of the highest military leaders, which were in charge of the massive human rights violations, the disappearances, the torture cases, the cases where children of persons who were prosecuted were taken away. These cases, they really reached to the top level of the military commanders, and due to the fact that this only was possible 30-40 years after the events, of course, has the problem now. They have the problem now that many of the accused are very old or dying, and not all the trials will go to the end. In Latin America, there were several lucky cases where police archives were abandoned, and then years afterwards they were found. There's one case in Paraguay where court officials actually found the archives of the police of the dictatorship of Stroessner, and these archives are now open for prosecutors, partly open also to the public, and are used in trials in Argentina. There's another interesting aspect in how archives are used. In the US, there is an organization, it's an NGO, the National Security Archive, and their mission is to get access to official US documents related to activities of the US abroad. So they systematically, through the Freedom of Information Act, are trying to get access to documents related to the activities of security services in, for example, Latin America, in the Philippines, and so on. And they analyze the documents, they make them accessible. It's all declassified material, which the state by itself didn't make accessible. Only through the pressure of the National Security Archive it became public. And this material is now used also in trials in Argentina and Guatemala. And for example, in Guatemala, they really managed to use this material in cases against the former president, and to systematically show with this material to prove connections which were not provable before, because they managed to fill gaps in the evidence which were only through this material they could be filled. Here the example of another police archive that was discovered, and there's some pictures how this archive was in a building of the former national police in Guatemala, and it had been abandoned and apparently forgotten because the police force that was involved during the civil war in massive human rights violations was dissolved with the peace agreement, and then this building was somehow forgotten, and it was years later in 2005 by accident found by the human rights ombudsman in Guatemala, and that's what the ombudsman found. Material just thrown away, paper in bags, destroyed. And with a huge effort, international and national archivists managed to save a lot of this material. And there's now, this police archive is now an important source for family members who are still looking for people who have disappeared, for prosecutors, for researchers, and all this material is made available online through the website of the University of Texas Libraries. The amazing thing with this material is that they were consciously putting all the information on the internet without blacking out names. So the entire material with names of victims, of potential perpetrators is accessible online. We are a bit concerned about how this is done, but talking to them, they say it's their policy. This is the way they think they can fight impunity in Guatemala. But in a context where you have an incredibly high crime rate and impunity, as in Guatemala, this seems a bit problematic. But it's one of the issues, of course, one has to think of when putting this information online and making it accessible to a broader public. But in the end, the material of the police archive, together with other evidence, played a hugely important role in the trial against former General Rios Montt, former president of Guatemala, who was accused for genocide against parts of the indigenous population in Guatemala. And the case took place last year, and a lot of the material of the police archive was used in this trial. He was in the end convicted, but the conviction is now suspended because of a procedural issue. It was suspended by the Supreme Court, but the trial has reached the first instance conviction. Another interesting use of archival material is the one I would like to show now. Memoria Abierta, it's another example, is an Argentinian coalition of non-governmental organizations that had started to collect material already during the military regime in the 70s and 80s, mainly by assisting victims, families of victims, families of disappeared people. And they have a huge archive of case files. And with the years, they together, the different organizations managed to have probably the most important archive on the military regime, and it's without taking into consideration the state archives that are only now slowly opened to the public. But by systematically collecting information on human rights violations, they managed to establish one of the most important dealing with the past archives. They are now using their material for to support judicial cases, prosecutions, and just one example, because they really have a very sophisticated way. They have these audiovisual legal registries, which are used by prosecutors. And just to give you an example how that looks, there is one here. They go by different places of detention. They describe where the place is, who was present during the inspection, either by the Truth Commission or by a court. They then use a plan of the site, and they link this plan to documents. court documents, it's a bit slow, and 2 photographs of the investigation. Here is the link to the document. It's also linked to a map of detention places, and it's linked then actually to the part of the audiovisual recording where the witnesses are brought to the place and questioned by the prosecutor. So you have actually an audiovisual file of the investigation of a certain place, and they bring all together, and it's accessible online to whoever is interested in it. This all concerns, of course, cases which were already adjudicated and not ongoing trials. As regards the right to reparation, this is more the restorative and compensatory part of dealing with the past, victim-oriented. There are national, international programs. For example, the International Organization of Migration runs important reparation programs. There's collective, individual reparation, material, symbolic, and often the right to reparation is forgotten. In many dealing with the past or transitional societies tend to focus on the right to justice, the right to know, and the right to reparation is often something that comes years later or is completely forgotten. I've been in Sarajevo recently, and there was the conference for the anniversary of the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. And in the Balkans, it's really obvious that all the focus was on the right to justice. There was the tribunal, which was very costly, which is taking a long time for its investigations and the prosecution of few cases. It's 160 cases, 160 accused persons. And there is no systematic reparation program. There are some small programs going on in different countries. And if you talk to victims, they're completely frustrated. They say it's important for us, the justice aspect is important, but the fact that we are still struggling, we lost our sons, we lost our husbands, and we are still struggling with our lives, and we didn't get anything, and we see how much is invested in justice. It's just, we can't understand it. And they were so frustrated to the point that they actually turned their backs when the president of the ICTY talked to the public. And forgetting this part of dealing with the past is obviously problematic. The same happened in Sierra Leone, where you had a very expensive international tribunal, you had an expensive truth commission, and the victims were just forgotten. In addition, you had a very important demobilization program where the perpetrators got money and they could move forward with their lives, and the victims just years later got a ridiculously small amount of money. The right to reparation, and this was very clear also by the victims I met in Sarajevo, it's not just money. Symbolic reparation can be as important as financial, and there obviously archives can play a very important role as well. Files of auto dealing with the past mechanisms are often used in reparation programs. In Argentina, the reparation program was based on the files of the Truth Commission, because there were individual case files they have established, and this was used in the reparation program. So the fact-finding of a Truth Commission is often essential for a reparation program. establishing who are actually the victims, who should be included in a reparation program. This decision is often based on the records of truth commissions. Then archives are used in a broader reparation effort or efforts to avoid the reoccurrence of what happened, which is very important for victims as well. And the assumption is, of course, if you know what happened, if young people understand what happened, it's more likely that the same things do not repeat. So the use of documental material, archival material in school curricula, school books, films, educational material is very important. The symbolic aspect of reparation, the documentation centers, museums that use archival sources are very important. Again, there are very interesting projects in Latin America, in Chile, in Argentina. In Argentina, you have several police archives which are partly used as archives, accessible to the public, or partly accessible to the public, and also used as memorial spaces, as spaces of meeting and education for young people. So the symbolic aspect of these archives can be very important. In Chile, the government decided to establish a memory museum, and they have a big documentation center and archive, which includes also the Truth Commission archives, archives of the church, archives documenting human rights violations, and this material is used in the museum. An excellent example also how this material can be used in online exhibition is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They, of course, have the resources for excellent use of their material in online educational projects. There's another interesting initiative. Some of the memory archives are part of the Memory of the World of the UNESCO. For example, in Argentina, a number of different archives holding information on human rights violations committed during the military regimes are were put together and presented to the UNESCO as human rights documentary heritage. So this was an important initiative in Argentina to bring together NGO archives, police archives, the Truth Commission archives, and to form a body of a memory archive on what had happened during the military regime. Again, as regards educational material, I think the example of Memoria Abierta is really good. They have, for example, this map of detention places where you can, they try to map all the clandestine detention places where people disappeared and were tortured all over Argentina. And on the internet, you can actually enter these places, and there's information of where it happened, who was the authority detaining people, the court cases related to the place, and so on. And this material is accessible to schools, not only on the internet, and Memoria Abierta also offers teachers' trainings on the issue. This kind of civil society initiatives play an important role where official truth-seeking mechanisms are lacking. For example, in the Balkans, you have very interesting initiatives where civil society organizations from the different countries try to establish databases on victims together oral history archives where they try to bring together different voices. And in a context like Bosnia or Croatia, Serbia, it's important because there are so different narratives on what happened, even if there is the official narrative of the International Tribunal. If you look at the realities of the people, it's still a very contested history, and therefore these initiatives by different organizations is very important. There's also this approach of having the Book of Losses, where all the victims of the conflicts are listed. You have this initiative in Kosovo, in Bosnia, and the different organizations doing that are interviewing people. It's partly oral history, partly bringing together official archival material and putting it. This is not accessible on the internet because for confidentiality reasons they keep most of the material for them, and only part of it is accessible. The issue of confidentiality and how you handle this kind of information obviously is important. Also, who may get access and how do you inform the people you're taking testimonies of is discussed amongst these memory workers all over. Just very shortly, there's another resource of document of memory workers from all over the world who've developed this document, remembering and narrating conflict, the methods they are using, and issues of consent, of confidentiality, of archiving of this material is discussed, and different experiences from Africa, Asia, South America are exchanged. So it's a very interesting resource as well. On our website here, you can find more information, more resources. We are working more as a hub, trying to bring together expertise from different parts of the world with requests for support from different parts. We're working currently in Northern Africa, Tunisia, with the National Archives, with the Philippines, with the Human Rights Commission, on documenting past violence and trying to bring in expertise from Argentina, from Guatemala, from other contexts, because there's a lot of expertise around, and I think it would be very interesting to connect this expertise more.
Thanks, Elisabeth. Because reparations depend on archives, almost entirely documentation to prove a case, as it were, even including symbolic reparations, are you aware of any societies where there's been a reasonable success rate in terms of reparations? Because I know it's even questioned quite severely in South Africa, for example.
Yeah. Well, there is the South American examples of Argentina, Chile, where they limited the reparations to certain cases of torture, disappearance, and it was somehow clear who the victims are to be compensated. So Morocco is also a good example. They had a quite successful reparation program based also on the archives of two truth commissions. They had two reparation programs, and interestingly, the one which was clearly linked to truth-finding mechanisms was considered as more rewarding for the victims. So the symbolic aspect of, or the aspect of having reparation linked to truth was seen as an important factor.
Okay, thank you, first of all, for your input. I think it's quite timely given where we're at in our own society. I mean, one of the questions that I have is in relation to the official archive or state archive, which is great because obviously it will uncover truths about the state where the state were responsible for atrocities, and I think that's fantastic for those families that were victimised through the state. But given that the majority of abuses in Northern Ireland weren't committed by the state, and were committed by paramilitary organisations, for those families, what sort of aspect of truth recovery can we put in place for them? I know that at the moment we're looking at the Haas proposals, and whilst I think it's a good document and it's probably all there, I think it does rely a lot on goodwill in terms of people coming and just wanting to unburden themselves, but that goodwill for me at present just really hasn't been there, and I don't know if it ever will.
Well, international experience shows that this is always a difficult issue, to get access to the information in mostly security sector archives is almost impossible. In Argentina, they're now at the stage where there are internal investigation, archivists doing internal investigation to map in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the Ministry of Defense, in the Army, to map what is still there, the information. And they're now at the stage that they start to do that. And for the Truth Commission in Argentina, they have a section in their report where they say we basically didn't have access. Or we were told that material was destroyed, or it's not existing anymore, or doesn't exist at all. And they really had to rely on other sources. And it's the same in all the contexts we work. It's true for South African Truth Commission. In the Philippines, the Human Rights Commission has almost no access to those files, although it was promised, and it's by national legislation that organizations try to get access to information acts, and it's very, very difficult.
You understand that states try to hide, of course, documentation stuff, but at least there's some paper trail.
Yes.
I suppose there's not the paper trail. I mean, I don't know if the IRA kept files and people they were, or the UVF, or that's the point.
That's the other problem too. I mean, if it concerns non-state actors, and again, I've worked in Sierra Leone with the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and a court has a bit more means to get access, and it was an international court. We had access to documents of the rebel groups. Sometimes it was handwritten radio reports, but at least you had something. But obviously there's much less, and you have to rely much more on other sources. That's where, of course, oral archives come in. And then the question is, well, are they up to the standards you would use in a trial or for a truth commission? And
what happens in terms of, and forgive me, I'm not an archivist, what happens in terms of contested histories, contested narratives, and when you've got multiple narratives which lay into one another, where does the dominant narrative, where is it enabled to be contested in an archival position when perhaps there are those whose voices are silenced or still being silenced in the process of recording and keeping those particular information there?
Yeah. It's interesting, we've just handed in a research proposal that is trying to find out examples of where archives were used and are used to contest the official narrative. And we are trying to bring together different experiences. Probably the National Security Archives in the US is one of the initiatives that tries to use actually official archives to question the official narrative, and they need to get access to documents, and it's obviously that it's withheld. It's quite difficult for them to get access, although it should be accessible. and but it needs an analysis, it needs an additional work, and in South Africa there also the South African Historical Archives is doing work in this regard, using their archives, using civil society archives and oral archives to also contest the official narrative, even the one established by the Truth Commission.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elisabeth. I just wondered, from your perspective, how the online archives are helping open access. So, for example, you've mentioned a number of archives that aren't accessible in the home countries like Guatemala or whatever. Will presumably an increase in the online availability of this sorts of material, will that help in the process of peace building, if you follow what I mean?
I think it really also depends. Just opening the archives by itself, I think it plays an important role, but it's just part of a broader initiative. But having access to documents, it's an essential part of dealing with the past. But then I think it needs to be embedded in other initiatives. I don't know how much the online archive I've showed from the National Police Archive is actually used, because if you don't understand how an archive is built, and if you don't understand how this police worked by itself, it's not very useful, especially for a broader public. If you are a researcher who knows very well what you're looking for, then it might be useful. But the police archives in Guatemala does a lot of outreach work. They analyze the material. They published a book on how the national police functioned, what were the different units, and they publish documents on different cases. So there's a lot of outreach work done. And Memoria Abierta as well is using its archives to do outreach. So I think there's an additional aspect to just opening archives, but it is an important step.
I suppose my question is a bit of a follow-on to that. I was wondering, how important is it to have the official truth recovery process, to have such a process in order to bring archives to bear on dealing with the past?
I personally think it's an important mechanism. Otherwise, you have bits and pieces. You have different organizations collecting different stories, and it's always somehow linked to maybe certain interest or a certain party in the conflict, and it's not. It doesn't have the same weight. It doesn't have the same systematic rigor as well as an official mechanism, where you have a certain way how you conduct the interviews, how you use the archives. An official mechanism might have different ways to access official archives, and so I think it gets a completely different dimension. And then if you look at what truth commissions do with what they collect, then obviously there is a work of analysis, of root causes, of patterns, of violations. And this is obviously lacking if you have different small civil society initiatives.
Thank you, Elisabeth. You mentioned there about mechanisms for compiling archives. In terms of gathering stories, have you found that there's a consistent method of developing an ethical framework around the gathering of stories? Or are there many differences? Obviously there's differences in terms of the areas and the people involved, in terms of what's been gathered, but is there consistency there, or is there sharing of information and how the ethical principles, how a framework's been developed? I
would say there's no consistency. We have like everything from people being told that their statement will be used for research, and then it's made available publicly in an exhibition. It's an example we saw in Israel, where a person is actually giving a statement about a crime he committed, and he thought it would be treated completely confidentially, and it was not. And then you have other organizations like the South African Historical Archives or Memoria Abierta, who have very high standards. They use methods of getting real informed consent, and are very conscious about protecting also the person giving the statement. So you have a whole range of different standards and methods. The document I've showed, developed by a Canadian researcher together with memory workers from all over the world, is for me quite a good document reflecting high standards of memory work and collecting statements.